Do you recall those moments as a young boy or even an early teenager for that matter, where you're sitting on the sofa and you turn on the TV, whether it be in the dead of summer to watch baseball or the middle of winter to check out the NFL, and in comes your dad as he sits next to you and you start watching the game, and he may share stories of the players and teams that he watched when he was growing up and talking about how great that era or those players were as we sit together and watch the game like father and son. Unfortunately, I didn't really have that. Now, that's not a knock on my dad, it just happened to be the circumstance. Now, he did take me to games when I was a boy, took me out to Shea Stadium when the Mets were putrid in the late 70s, early 80s, and actually took me to my second Knick game ever in Madison Square Garden when the Boston Celtics came to town right before my birthday in 1978. And John Havlicek, the great Celtic, was saying his final farewell to the New York crowd, and being in person for that moment, I said to myself, wait a minute, is this the team I need to be rooting for? Not the team that's in blue and orange, but the team that's green and white. Well, lo and behold, that just so happened to be the case. But we're not talking about the Celtics, we're not talking about the NBA, we're talking about sports in general, especially when it comes to father and son. Never really had that with my dad. And that's all right, and that's okay. But here it was throughout the mid-70s into the early 80s as I followed a particular football team that was not from New York. And growing up in the Northeast Bronx back in the 70s, the Jets and Giants were so bad that you had to root for two other teams. And the two other teams at that time were the Pittsburgh Steelers or the Dallas Cowboys. And I pledged my allegiance to the black and yellow, or black and gold, however you want to call it. And I have not turned back ever since. And interestingly enough, when I watched both Super Bowls 13 and 14 as a young boy, 9 and 10 years old respectively, I was on the top of the NFL mountain. I'm thinking like, wow, Terry Bradshaw, Franco Harris, Rocky Bleier, Mean Joe Green, L.C. Greenwood, Jack Lambert, Jack Ham, all the Hall of Famers that were littered throughout that roster. And I'm thinking, this is fantastic. I'm just a young boy and my team had become Super Bowl champions in back-to-back years. Now, mind you, 4 or 5 years before that, in Super Bowls 9 and 10, I was still a little too young to grasp the idea of NFL football. But I certainly caught on at the right time there in the late 70s. And then there was a long period where the Steelers had not won. And it was a situation where, were they ever gonna win? Obviously, they needed a quarterback, considering that Terry Bradshaw played his last game at the old Shea Stadium where my beloved Mets used to play. And after that, it was just a laundry list of quarterbacks who never lived up or came even close to his billing. Whether your name is Cliff Stout, Todd Blackledge, David Woodley, Bubby Brister, Neil O'Donnell. Please, I could go on and on and on as far as these Steeler quarterbacks until we got to Ben Roethlisberger. And yes, when Big Ben was drafted in 2004, it looked like it was going to be a situation where we finally have gotten our big-time quarterback. Because from the time Ben was drafted to when Terry Bradshaw said goodbye, it's not as if the Steelers didn't have any success. Obviously they did, especially once Bill Cowher came into the fold after Chuck Noll said sayonara on his illustrious career. And then it became a situation where Bill Cowher was taking his team to the playoffs. 92 as a 1 seed, but losing to the Bills in the Divisional Round. The following year, losing an excruciating game in Kansas City in the wild card round. A block punt and a 4th and goal at the 7, Joe Montana touchdown, and away we go. Then in 94, another 1 seed, and it was a scenario where the Steelers had the AFC Championship game in their building against the San Diego Chargers. Oh, that is a game that still sticks to my ribs, even when the Steelers have had plenty of success after that. But I'm gonna get to that in another video, so you wanna stay tuned for that one. So if you haven't hit subscribe, if you could do that, I'd appreciate it. Okay, shameless plugs aside, you had a situation where the Steelers did have success under Cowher, where they did go to AFC Championship games, although lost in just excruciating fashion. Whether it was 94 to the San Diego Chargers. Now the next year, the motto was 3 more yards because they fell 3 yards short of the goal line and trying to get into the end zone to get themselves to Miami to play San Francisco in Super Bowl 29. But the following year, in a very underrated and thrilling AFC Championship game where Aaron Bailey looked like he caught it in the back of the end zone, but it squirted through and hit the Three Rivers Stadium turf. And the next thing you know, the Steelers went on to the Super Bowl before losing to the Dallas Cowboys, our longtime rival, in Super Bowl 30. And then the year after, a lost game in the fog up in Foxborough against the Patriots. The following year, another AFC Championship appearance where just a few weeks prior to that, the Steelers beat the Broncos in their building in come-from-behind fashion. Only that wasn't to be duplicated in the championship game because of Cordell Stewart and some boneheaded picks, especially Bill Romanowski. Man, I could just see that as clear as it was if the game was played yesterday. And then you fast forward to 2001, where the AFC Championship game in their building, where the Patriots came in, and the Patriots pretty much won on 2 plays. They had the blocked field goal, and before that, they had the punt return for a touchdown, where unfortunately Troy Edwards was flagged for out of bounds, where they re-kicked it, and then 55 yards later, the Patriots are in the end zone. And remember, that was a game where the Steelers knocked out Tom Brady. The memories. And I know Cordell Stewart airmailing a couple of passes there as the game got close, as they tried to get the game-tying score, in fact, at 24-17, but it was not to be done on that Sunday afternoon. And then a few years later, where they faced the Patriots again in an AFC Championship game. And mind you, this is where Ben Roethlisberger now gets ushered in. 15-1 he was that year. He had won 13 straight games. 1 seed in the AFC, hosting on a very cold day in Pittsburgh. But when Jerome Bettis got stopped, I'll never forget it, on a 4th and 1, and I believe off the top of my head the score was 3-0. And what happened? Next play after getting stopped, Brady says, "I'm going for the juggler." And he certainly did. Long bomb in the seam, touchdown, 10-0, and pretty much the rest was history. And you could really put the icing on the cake when Ben Roethlisberger, right before the half, got picked off. I believe the score 17-7, and he took it all the way to the house, almost 100 yards. And from that point on, you knew the Steelers were doomed. And then it became a point where I've been following this team now since a boy. And granted, yes, I did see the 2 Super Bowls. Granted, I was just breaking double digits as far as my age goes. And here I am, starving, hoping for a championship. Well, now it's 2005. And to think, that was 20 years ago. Well, the season that was, but remember, it was 2005 season. When you turn the calendar to 2006, that's when the playoffs begun. So you got to look at it as the 2005 season. And here it was, the Steelers, who marched into the playoffs on a high note, winning 4 straight games after going 7-5, and they needed to run the table in order for them to get into the postseason that year because they were a 6th seed in the AFC. This was before they expanded to 7 positions in the playoffs, to where now it seems like almost half the teams in the conference get in. But back then, as a 6th seed, 11-5, still a very good, respectable record. But you thought to yourselves, all right, let's see what they could do. They're going to Cincinnati to play in their wildcard matchup. And a funny thing happened along the way. And I can't even recall of a conversation or even a text thread back then, because until the smartphone came a couple of years later with the iPhone, I can't remember texting my dad any information about going to watch the Steelers at this particular bar in Manhattan, 79th and Broadway, called Blondie's. That is a Steeler bar, tried and true, and I believe it still is to this day. Now, I haven't gone in years, obviously, with the advent of DirecTV back in the day, on top of now being streamed on YouTube. There's no need to leave the privacy of your own home to go to a sports bar with other Steeler fans to cheer your team on to victory. But with this particular playoff game, I must have had this discussion with him, because I did say to him, yeah, I'm going to watch the Steelers. I'm going to go to this place in Manhattan called Blondie's, 79th and Broadway, what have you. And mind you, this is prior to the smartphone. So I'm sure my dad had to MapQuest or do some sort of research as far as where this bar was, because as strange as this may sound, as I'm in the bar, hanging out, getting ready for the game to start, and for whatever reason, right at this very spot, I felt 2 hands cover my eyes, thinking, who the hell, what the hell? And I turn around, and it just so happened to be my father coming down to watch the game with me. And I wasn't expecting it. My father at the time was living in Rockland County, which is a couple of counties north from where I lived in the Bronx. So for him to come all the way down, which I think is a little bit over an hour, obviously meant a lot. And like I said earlier, I didn't really have a lot of memories with my dad when it comes to watching sports, other than going to a handful of ball games. And that's the thing. Generally, when you have those moments with your dad, especially when it comes to watching sports, you remember where you are and you remember what certain things happen. In fact, as crazy as this is gonna sound, and this just came to me right now, I swear. April 8th, 1974, the day where Hank Aaron broke Babe Ruth's record for career home runs by a major leaguer, 715. I happened to be with my dad that day, and we were in the Bronx. I'll never forget, in the Soundview area, and we went into somebody's home, and on a black and white TV on a stand, they actually were watching the game, because I believe it was on NBC. And sure enough, you saw how Hank Aaron did hit that home run. And I remember it as if it happened last month, but I digress. So now here it is. We're standing there with all the TV screens in front of us. And mind you, this is before high definition. This is where you had the old 32-inch Sony Vega screens or Wega screens, whatever they were. So now we're watching the game. And as we're watching it unfold, the Bengals go off to a 10-0 lead. But prior to that, the Steelers knock out Carson Palmer on that hit by Kimo von Oelhoffen, which a lot of people thought was dirty and it was intentional, etc. But come on, Kimo von Oelhoffen, he was actually a former Bengal. Now, I don't believe he was a teammate of Carson Palmer when he was with Cincinnati at the time, but he's the last guy that you're even going to think that he was trying to get some sort of low cheap shot in on the Bengal quarterback. And as it was, they still had a 10-0 lead. And even though Willie Parker cut it to 10-7 and John Kitna, who came in relief for Carson Palmer, actually filled in admirably. And he did a very good job to where the Bengals had a 17-7 lead. And the first thing you thought was, wait a second, are the Steelers going to be in trouble here? You can't lose to the Bengals. Now, the Bengals were a 3 seed and they won the AFC North. So we knew that it wasn't going to be an easy go for it because on the road, not to say that that's hostile environment or hostile territory, but still, it was going to be quite a bit to overcome when you're down by 10 on the road. But then the Steelers did cut the deficit 17-14. You said, all right, we got a game. But right out of the first half, going into the second half, and knowing that there were stories about Carson Palmer going to be out for the game, and it looked like it was going to be season ending and ACL, etc., I thought to myself at the time, it's going to be interesting to see how the Bengals play the second half. Are they going to come out firing? Are they going to be aggressive? Are they going to be a team that's going to play to win, or are they just going to hang tight and see what happens and almost play not to lose? And as it was, they came out firing. In fact, they were getting ready to line up for a field goal, which would have extended their 17-14 lead to 20-14. But just as the play that the Steelers needed the most, and which was the play of the game, the snap went high on that field goal attempt. Steelers pick up the ball, recover, and now we have new life. To the point where we were able to march on down the field, punching into the end zone. Next thing you know, the game has turned around. It is now 21-17, and the Steelers have all the gas in their tank. And then, of course, came even a bigger play later on. At midfield, Ben Roethlisberger in shotgun, where he had Antoine Randall there right next to him. And as the snap went and Roethlisberger went up, Randall catches the ball. He goes to the right side, almost to the sideline, before he turns around and throws a pass just over the outreach defender there by the Bengals, where Ben catches it, finds his man downfield, which happened to be Cedric Wilson. Touchdown, 28-17. And to me, that was the dagger. And then the Steelers took over on defense, punishing that Bengal offense to the point where they had no answers. And obviously, Carson Palmer was not coming back out of that tunnel anytime soon. And the Steelers were able to prevail. Now, was it a big victory? I guess it was, because despite the fact that the Steelers-Bengals was pretty much even, and even though the Bengals had the home field advantage because they had the tiebreaker against the Steelers that year, and it wasn't an impossible game for them to win, but they came out of that game 31-17 after a couple of turnovers, and like I said, the defense making a bunch of stops, and the Bengals certainly could not find any rhythm on their offense there in the second half that they had in the first half, even without their starting quarterback. So there it was, just like that. Game one in the books, had its moments, had its thrills, but it was just a wild card game. Just one step, hopefully, that would lead us to the following step, which would be the Indianapolis Colts, the top-seeded Colts, who had a big-time quarterback in Peyton Manning and obviously had the best record in the conference. So now it's a situation where after the Steelers won, and I turned to my dad and we hugged it out a little bit, and he said that he was going to come back next week and watch the game. He asked what time. I said the game is going to be 1 o'clock next Sunday. All right, I'll be here. And the one thing about my dad, he's still around with us, thank God, and I love him to pieces. But my dad wasn't the most reliable guy. And although it sounded great that he was going to come back down and wanted to spend more time and see how far this run would go, now mind you, it was only one game, but he was certainly curious. He was certainly interested. And he knew that I'd been a lifelong Steeler fan. So it'd be an automatic that he would come back the following week and watch the Steelers and Colts play in the Divisional Round, right? Or maybe not. That we'd have to wait and see. But I would say, for the first game, and him showing up unexpectedly and watching the Steelers and rooting them to victory was certainly a nice moment. It was great. But now to me, what would really stick is if he come the next week, because that was even going to be a bigger game against a bigger opponent and bigger stakes to upset the top-seeded team in the AFC and move on to another AFC Championship game. So now lies the big question. Does he come through the following week to watch with me? Thanks so much for watching this video. I have other Pittsburgh Steelers content like this one right here, so if you could definitely click on that, I'd appreciate it. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I would also appreciate that as well, and thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is real sports talk, true sports talk, made by a sports fan like me, for you guys and gals who are sports fan. Passionate sports talk, no clickbait, no rage bait, none of that, I can promise you that. And until next time, on the flip.